Pitirim Sorokin, a Successor to the Slavophiles, by Frederick Matern. Slavophile is a label which hides as much as it reveals. For a student of intellectual history, representatives of a movement with such a title are bound to be of concern only to those who deal with Slavic nations, particularly Russia, or with Orthodox Christian theology. But the name would seem to point away from any universal concept. At best, it would seem a relic of the 19th century. At worst, a potential catalyst for ugly forms of nationalism in the 21st. There is, however, at least one unofficial modern Slavophile who lived in the 20th century and wrote primarily in English for a Western audience, but whose thoughts about society and culture clearly show at least indirect influence from the early Slavophile movement, including Khomiakov's philosophy of history, even if no direct credit is given. That modern Slavophile was Pitirim Sorokin, 1889 to 1968. Sorokin represents an interesting and unique phenomenon in the history of social thought. The background of this sociologist and the circumstances that brought him across the Atlantic from Russia, and intellectually speaking from 19th century through the pivotal and disruptive years of the Russian Revolution to the burgeoning American society of the 20th century, make him, in a sense, a bridge across space and time between two very different cultural worlds. Slavophilism seems by its very name to be firmly localized and temporized, belonging only to one place and period of history, Russia of the 19th century. As Nikolai Berdyaev states, the controversy between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers was a dispute about the destiny of Russia and its vocation in the world. Such a controversy would seem to exclude the interests of anyone not willing to dispute about Russia. Yet the early Slavophiles, including Alexei Khomiakov, often called upon transcendent principles in their defense of the idea of Russia. Philosophically, these early Slavophiles were remarkably cosmopolitan in their approach to such problems as those posed by the philosophy of history. These transcendent principles forming the basis of a Russian mission can be seen later in the 19th century, in the writing of Solovyov and Dostoevsky. It is in this vein, philosophical and cosmopolitan, that Sorokin seems to bring such clear notes of Slavophile thought into his sociology, a sociology that matured during his long career in the United States of America, not in isolation from, but in dialogue with other American practitioners of sociology. And it is worth noting that the vast majority of Sorokin's scholarly output was originally in English. This chapter will demonstrate that Sorokin's philosophy of history displays signs of being a development of Khomiakov's philosophy of history. At the very least, it will be seen that Sorokin can be regarded as a 20th century Slavophile, but it will also illustrate the idea that Khomiakov's Slavophilism is compatible with a pluralistic, even cosmopolitan worldview such as Sorokin's. This view is compatible with a view of the Slavophile movement that was not merely a localized debate at a particular time in history, but the wellspring of a number of indirect successor schools of thought. Sorokin was a sociologist and, during his early career, a political activist. He was born in 1889 in the village of Turia, then the Vologda Governorate, now the Komi Republic, to a Russian icon painter and an ethnic Komi mother who died when he was 3 years old. As a child, the young Pitirim wandered from village to village with his elder brother and his alcoholic father. His younger brother was raised by an aunt and uncle. As a boy, Sorokin learned his father's icon painting trade while beginning to read and write. After a violent drunken outburst by his father during his youth, he and his elder brother set off to live on their own, making a living in their father's trade while studying sporadically. His father died a year after their separation, and both of his brothers died in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Despite this, Sorokin went to a teacher's seminary, where he befriended Nikolai Kondratiev, an economist who later became well known around the world for his theory of business cycles, and became politically active in the Socialist Revolutionary (SR) party. This association is of note due to the philosophical differences Sorokin found between this party and the Marxists. In Sorokin's words, unlike Marxist materialism and the economic interpretation of man and history, the philosophy and sociology of the Social Revolutionary Party were much more idealistic or integralistic. They emphasized strongly the role of creative ideas, voluntary efforts. Thus, in spite of the shift from his early traditional worldview to a socialist one, he tended to reject materialism and positivism, which became an important theme in his later intellectual life. Sorokin continued his studies at St. Petersburg, where he studied sociology and criminology. He remained active in the Social Revolutionary Party. After the February Revolution in 1917, Alexander Kerensky, premier of the Provisional Government, chose Sorokin to be his secretary. Sorokin was arrested after the Bolsheviks came to power. After some 6 weeks in prison, in line to be executed, he was released. After his release, he was able to teach at university and published his system of sociology and continued to teach and publish critical notes about the new regime. But by 1922, the regime decided that he and a large number of other intellectuals must leave Russia, and he became part of that well-known community of exiles. After some time in Europe, he went to America and found a job teaching at the University of Minnesota. During his 6 years there, he published some studies that would be considered more mainstream and highly regarded sociological fare in the American context. For example, hunger is a factor in human affairs. He then received the call from Harvard to chair that university's new Department of Sociology. It was here, during the Great Depression, that he received a large grant to work on his social and cultural dynamics, a publication which would prove very controversial in his professional community and marked a turning point in his career. 3 volumes were published in 1937, and a final one, introducing his idea of integralism, was completed in 1941. This publication led to his marginalization from mainstream sociology, but he was able, through a grant from Eli Lilly, to further his work in the study of altruism as a possible solution to the crisis he identified in the dynamics, and other publications, and he remained popular as a public intellectual throughout his retirement. In his methods, the various scholars who have studied him have found him to be a disciple of behaviorists such as Pareto, of positivism and Comte, or even of St. Thomas Aquinas, while he himself has written about his own affinity to the Christian anarchism of Tolstoy, which indicates a Slavophile influence. Lawrence T. Nichols has made a more direct link to the primacy of his Russian religious philosophical heritage, showing affinity with Nikolai O. Losky, Vladimir S. Solovyov, and of interest in the present context, the Slavophiles Ivan Kireevsky and Alexei Khomiakov. This affinity is in despite of some of the only direct commentary Sorokin made on the Slavophiles, unfavorably comparing their messianism with that of the Bolsheviks in 1917, when he was politically active in the provisional government and writing editorials for the newspaper Volya Naroda, the People's Will. Nichols argues that Sorokin's marginalization in American social science was the result of a lack of understanding of the sociopolitical, intellectual, and cultural formative context of his early life and career, and pointed to the early Slavophile philosophy of Kireevsky and Khomiakov as being characteristic of Sorokin's work in the last phase of his career, beginning in 1937 with the publication of Social and Cultural Dynamics, where the concept of integralism first began to be developed in Sorokin's sociology. A couple of interesting points stand out from Nichols's reviews of Sorokin in the context of his Russian heritage. The first is that Sorokin, who was encyclopedic in his citations of many hundreds of thinkers of the past, pays scant or no attention to the early Slavophiles in his works. In one of his late works on creative altruism, he relies heavily on Solovyov, and as regards Nikolai Losky, Sorokin collaborated with him in the research on the dynamics and maintained an amicable relationship with his fellow exile. The second is that the one other successor of the Slavophiles that Sorokin devotes considerable attention to in a number of works is Nikolai Danilyevsky, rather than figures who would appear to be more intellectually aligned, such as Khomiakov or Kireevsky. Sorokin saw Danielewski as a direct influence on Spengler. The prominent place of integralism in Sorokin's epistemology is indeed a similarity with the philosophy of Kireevsky, as Nichols has pointed out. There are, nonetheless, striking features of Sorokin's work that recall Khomiakov's philosophy of history and society more than perhaps any other single predecessor. There are 3 major themes in Sorokin's work that can, in a broad sense, be found in Khomiakov. First, unlike Kireevsky, both Khomiakov and Sorokin developed a philosophy of history that was based on the succession of broad cultural systems where basic worldviews, in Khomiakov's parlance, faith, change over time. Second, Sorokin's tendency, in a way similar to Khomiakov's, was to regard the West, that is Europe and a Europeanized America, as worthy of deep respect, but now in a phase of senility or decay, which would ultimately lead to the ceding of place to emerging cultures from the East, or as Sorokin stated, Afro-Asian cultures and peoples. Third, the principle of altruistic love developed by Sorokin as the means to integrate society compares well with Khomiakov's development of the concept of sobornost. According to Sorokin, the central claim of his sociology is that sociocultural reality is a complex manifold, with inexhaustible modes of being which the human mind is unable to grasp in its totality, but can gain partial access to via 3 forms or differentiations, which require 3 distinct epistemological bases and therefore 3 differing types of methodologies. There is, first, its empirical aspect, which must be studied through sensory, empirical methods. These methods are appropriate to discovering what Sorokin calls the truth of the senses. The subject matter of the truth of the senses is mainly the world of sensory perception, such as the phenomena studied in the natural sciences. This worldview tends to reduce phenomena of culture, psychology, and values to their sensory or material forms. There is next what Sorokin refers to as a logico-rational aspect, the truth of reason, which can be apprehended through the discursive logic of human reason, including mathematical, deductive, and inductive reasoning. Finally, there is what Sorokin refers to as supersensory, superrational, or metalogical reasoning. By the first two designations, Sorokin means that major religions, ethical norms, and fine arts cannot be reduced to a complex of sensations or to rational or logical propositions. The truth proposition is the truth of faith, which is perceived as a mystical or metalogical intuition. Mystic experience provides the ultimate foundations of the great systems of art, ethics, and religion. Mystical or metalogical intuition will normally be the foundation on which a logico-empirical structure of a cultural supersystem is built. It is necessary, according to Sorokin, to use all of these different ways of knowing in order to grasp the truth. None of these three systems is, on its own, sufficient to grasp reality. Cultures, according to Sorokin, tend to build the frames through which they view reality primarily through only one of these three aspects, and cultural phenomena of all sorts tend to be built around these primordial frames. Sorokin's observation about cultures is that they tend to be a system of meanings and values, rather than a dumping ground of unrelated phenomena. Whole systems of belief about the world, with concomitant reflections in a culture's dominant systems of philosophy, ethics, law, science, art, politics, and so on, tend to be integrated to a great extent. It is the dynamics of these systems of thought that form the basis of the major developments in history. The driving force identified by Sorokin bore itself out in systems based on the culture's perception of reality and derivation of truth. Other cultural elements, whether fine arts, laws, morals, ethics, systems of government, are dependent on the major premise of the prevailing worldview. Worldviews are never in a full equilibrium, as they are part of a living social system that cannot be static. Sensate worldviews derive their truth from the senses. Cultures exhibiting this major premise will tend to produce works of philosophy, art, science, literature that reflect this bias towards the senses. This tendency will also be seen in the systems of law, government, and ethics that predominate in these cultures. In time, such a culture inevitably reaches a limit and is pushed towards a worldview which has as its major premise a supersensory truth of faith. Sorokin called this kind of supersystem ideational. Finally, between these two integrated forms, there can be any number of mixed forms of culture. But Sorokin reserves a special place for a culture where a system of truth integrates in a harmonious way empirical systems of truth with the supersensory, calling this mixed form idealistic. Its premise is truth of both faith and the senses, moderated by our faculty of reason. Sorokin's study of history, based on these categories, showed that classical and Western culture moved from an idealistic phase in classical Greece during the time of Plato and Aristotle through a sensate phase during the Hellenistic, the dominance of Epicureanism being characteristic of the sensate worldview. This was followed by an ideational phase during the period we call the Dark Ages, but the High Middle Ages represented a mixed system, that is, an idealistic phase coinciding with scholasticism. Since then, a long growth of sensate culture has been characteristic, reaching what Sorokin found to be an extreme level even by the early 20th century. Characterized by logical positivism, scientism in the social sciences, atomized individualistic society, art preoccupied with sex and criminality, and also the brutal First World War, and even more brutal and bestial Second World War. Taken in isolation, Sorokin's worldview seems inconsistent, and the three labels of sensate, idealistic, and ideational have been misread as an ascent or descent through stages, as in the philosophy of Comte. Sorokin, in fact, saw Comte's theory, along with other linear conceptions of social and historical change, as eschatological and fallacious. Sorokin's view of history was not linear at all, but rather described fluctuations in the dominance or preponderance of the basic sociocultural types over long timescales. As regards the apparent similarities to Vico, Sorokin clearly admired the Italian's philosophy of history and was indeed a proponent of a cyclical theory of the history of society. It is very tempting to draw a parallel between Sorokin's ideational, idealistic, and sensate phases and Vico's repeating ages of gods, heroes, and men, which correspond to similar periods in history. However, Sorokin is clear that while there is inevitability to the oscillation between sensate and ideational culture types, the exact path of points in between can vary, and the advent of the idealistic type is not a certainty. Also, the ideational and sensate poles are ideal types of complex integrated systems, and, empirically speaking, no culture is likely ever to have been purely ideational or sensate. At the same time, the idealistic system only exists as an integration of the sensate and ideational systems, which is likely the reason why, starting with the last volume of the Dynamics, Sorokin began to use the word integral to describe this particular integrated culture. This disconnection between Sorokin's developing epistemological position and his philosophy of history causes confusion among even the most supportive students of Sorokin. Colbert Rhodes, for example, is of the view that Sorokin's philosophy of history is built around three types of integrated culture, each built around one of the systems of being and of knowing that Sorokin enumerated later in his career. It may well be that Sorokin had begun to form his epistemological system in parallel with his philosophy of history, even if it only began to be clearly articulated late in his life. It was, however, the view of a sufficiently mature Sorokin in his Dynamics that many systems of logically integrated culture are conceivable, each with a different set of major premises but consistent within itself. He goes on to say that few of these conceivable integrated systems will be reflected in cultural systems that have in fact existed in history, and that the idealistic culture was one of a number of mixed supersystems, albeit the only logically integrated one. But the main premise of Sorokin's philosophy of history is that cultures oscillate over time between two profoundly different ideal types, and may, in the right circumstances, settle for a time on an idealistic type that combines the best features of the two polar types. In a tradition of Russian social criticism dating back to Vladimir Odoyevsky and the early Slavophiles, Sorokin saw Western civilization of the present day as having exhausted the possibilities of the sensate cultural system. Sensate Western society had reached its internal limits and was now undergoing a profound shift, a disintegration of that form of culture that would be succeeded by a reintegration into a different form of culture, with its concomitant meanings, norms, and values. Sorokin's philosophy would therefore seem more consistent when viewed as a development of the Slavophile outlook. Khomiakov, in his philosophy of history outlined in the Notes on Universal History, also sees history as a movement between two main ideal types. In Khomiakov's version, these types are based on a voluntaristic typology of religion, based on the religion's relationship to the categories of freedom and necessity. Sorokin's types are centered on a unity created by an adherence to a fundamental axiological principle, where all facets of a culture articulate the same basic value. Furthermore, for both Khomiakov and Sorokin, social and cultural systems are prone to change, and this change is not exclusively due to external forces acting on social and cultural groups. Khomiakov writes in his essay on Humboldt that, quote, societies do not collapse because of some great cataclysm or in consequence of some struggle. They fall even as old trees which have lost all their vital sap but still have just recently withstood a severe storm, sometimes fall, thundering and booming, on still night, when there is not movement enough in the air to stir a leaf on the healthy trees. They die as old men die who, as the people say, are tired of living, unquote. Sorokin's view of societal change is not very different, although it shows a characteristic search for a golden mean. Against externalistic theories of sociocultural change, which look for causes or forces outside of the sociocultural system itself, Sorokin places theories of immanent change, that change is a property of the system itself, and sides with that view, with the proviso that external or cosmic factors can influence change in such a system. Thus, like Khomiakov, he is of the opinion that change is imminent, like the tree that has lost its sap. External forces, like the storm, can nonetheless force change on the system. Furthermore, Khomiakov's philosophy of history, as expressed in his notes, contains not only a dialectic of sorts with an oscillation over historical time of two value principles, labeled by Khomiakov as Kushite and Iranian, but really in essence the principle of determinism and that of freedom. There is also an attempt to reconcile opposing principles of unity and freedom using the idea of sobornost, linking the Slavophile ideal in history to a kind of integralism, to use Sorokin's preferred term. Thus, in Khomiakov's view, the Roman world saw unity and freedom as opposing forces, and regarded unity as superior. This disposition expressed itself in a tendency toward hierarchy, the subordination to the Pope, militant monastic orders, and universal use of Latin. The Germanic world favored, in his scheme, the opposite view, in the reaction that led to the Reformation, which sacrificed unity for freedom, a tendency that led Protestantism into philosophic skepticism. Only in orthodoxy, for Khomiakov, can be found the reconciliation of these principles. This theme was later taken up by a young Solovyov in his lecture on three forces. But this time the history of religion was supplanted by national principles, defined in part by religion, where throughout history a centrifugal force acts to subordinate humanity to one ruling principle, a centripetal one, which asserts the primacy of the atomized individual, and finally a third integral, unifying principle, where the nation would be called upon not only to reconcile and uplift the opposing principles as an intermediary between the world and a revealed, transcendent world. For Solovyov, the three principles were embodied in the Muslim Ottoman Empire, the nations of the West, and the Slavic world, particularly the Russian Empire, respectively. Khomiakov and Solovyov's conceptions can be seen as the start of a trend that culminates in Sorokin's study of changes between ideational, sensate, and idealistic or integral cultural supersystems. What Sorokin shares with his two predecessors is not so much agreement on exactly how or what changes in the course of history, but the value placed on the integral as the supreme and universal ideal of historical balance. Compared to Khomiakov and the early Solovyov, Sorokin is more willing to look for this ideal in different cultures and places. Thus, the systems of Plato, Aristotle, Albert the Great, and Aquinas are all supreme examples, for Sorokin, of an attempt to embrace in one organic whole divine as well as sensory and dialectic truth. In his approach to accessing knowledge of this truth, Sorokin places himself together with a large current of Russian philosophy, post-dating Khomiakov, in the camp of ontologism in epistemology, which Zenkovsky identifies as a characteristic of Khomiakov's epistemology and trend in Russian philosophy generally. Specifically, Sorokin identified intuition with a direct knowledge of being, an identification of subject and object. In The Ways and Power of Love, Sorokin explains how this superconscious intuition of being provides access to the highest forms of creative love, which for him is humanity's only real hope to avoid catastrophe. Khomiakov's epistemology led him, much earlier, to similar universalistic conclusions of the ability of faith and love, as against reason, to bring one into contact with reality, with the truth, where other external ways of knowing can only lead to an imperfect knowledge of reality. The living knowledge of faith and love, and their precedence over the incomplete knowledge of reason, are an integral part of Khomiakov's conception of sobornost. Given the profound influence of Khomiakov on Russian social thought, and the depth to which Sorokin was steeped in the ideas of his country of birth, there is a case to be made that Sorokin's body of work represents an inheritance of Khomiakov and Slavophile thought more generally in the English-speaking world and beyond. While the philosophy of history expounded in the dynamics did not leave a deep imprint in the Western practice of sociology, it may merely be a matter of time before conditions will be ripe for a revisiting of Sorokin's theories of cultural change, as well as for further development of the sobornost-like theory of altruism that Sorokin began to develop a century after the Slavophiles. Due to his tremendous popularity, in mid-20th century America, there is an extensive availability of Sorokin's vast output to draw from for scholars willing to explore his work. It is quite possible that the work of another post-Slavophile, the Pan-Slavist Danilevsky, has already had a profound influence on early 21st century social and political thought, since it remains possible that Danilevsky was one of the influences on Spengler and Toynbee, who in turn inspired Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. The availability of so many copies of Sorokin's works may indeed prove to be a bridge for the more universalistic aspects of Slavophile thought into the 21st century.